In the breathtaking yet perilous landscapes of North America's wilderness, a series of harrowing encounters with grizzly bears serve as stark reminders of nature's unpredictable power. From a group of hikers in Montana who underestimated the risks to a father and son on a hunting trip in Wyoming, each story reveals the consequences of ignoring warnings and underestimating wildlife. Join us as we delve into these gripping tales of survival, trauma, and the hard-earned lessons learned in the heart of the wild. The chill of early autumn hung in the air as 5 hikers set off into the wilderness of Montana's Rockies. Their packs were heavy with provisions, and their spirits were light with the promise of adventure. Emma, the most experienced of the group, led the way with steady determination. Behind her, Mark and Jenna walked side by side, their laughter cutting through the morning mist. Caleb and Sophie brought up the rear, their energy boundless as they marveled at the vibrant foliage and jagged peaks that framed their path. Warnings about a grizzly bear sighting in the area had been casually mentioned at the ranger station. The hikers exchanged uneasy glances but dismissed the danger. Grizzlies rarely attacked groups after all, and they had bear spray, 2 cans for the 5 of them. Safety in numbers felt like an unspoken guarantee as they followed the remote trail into the heart of the forest. Hours passed as the group ascended through dense woods, the trail narrowing and the sunlight filtering in dappled beams. They stopped for lunch in a clearing, the forest alive with the faint rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. Spirits remained high, though Emma's gaze lingered on the dark tree line more than once. She didn't voice her unease, not wanting to dampen the group's enthusiasm. As the day stretched on, the forest seemed to grow quieter, the air heavy with an almost imperceptible tension. The hikers pressed forward, oblivious to the signs, fresh claw marks gouged into tree trunks, patches of disturbed earth. It wasn't until they entered a particularly dense section of the woods that Emma froze, her sharp intake of breath drawing the others to a halt. Ahead, a massive grizzly bear stood partially obscured by foliage, its dark eyes fixed on them. For a moment, no one moved. The bear regarded them with an almost indifferent calm, its powerful frame motionless but imposing. Emma's mind raced through the safety protocols she'd read countless times. Stay together, don't run, make yourself look larger. Her hand drifted to the canister of bear spray on her belt. Behind her, the group struggled to suppress their panic. Jenna's breathing quickened, and Caleb shifted uneasily. Then, as if the tension had become too much to bear, Sophie took a step back, her foot catching on a root. She stumbled, her movement abrupt and startling in the oppressive silence. The bear's ears twitched, and its calm demeanor fractured. With a low growl, it stepped forward. What happened next unfolded in chaotic fragments. Caleb, overcome by fear, broke into a sprint, his panicked flight triggering the bear's predatory instinct. The grizzly roared and charged, its speed horrifyingly fast for its size. The group scattered, the instinct to survive overwhelming any sense of cohesion. Emma yelled something, though the words were lost to the din of pounding feet and the bear's guttural growls, and fumbled for her bear spray as she ran. Jenna and Sophie bolted in one direction, their cries echoing through the trees while Mark veered off with Emma. Caleb, his earlier head start putting him ahead of the others, glanced back in terror and tripped on uneven ground. The bear was on him in moments, its massive paws striking him down with terrifying force. His scream cut through the forest, raw and visceral, before it was silenced. Mark and Emma skidded to a stop, turning back as the bear's focus shifted to the others. Jenna and Sophie had become separated in their frantic flight. Sophie, disoriented, stumbled into a thicket and fell, her leg twisting beneath her. She cried out in pain, the sound carrying through the trees. Jenna froze a few yards away, torn between helping her friend and the instinct to keep running. Emma and Mark acted quickly. Summoning what courage they could, they ran back toward the bear, their bear spray canisters ready. The grizzly loomed over Caleb's still form, its attention snapping to the newcomers as they approached. Emma fired her spray first, the bright orange mist catching the bear's muzzle. It roared in frustration, shaking its massive head. Mark joined in, the dual streams forming a barrier between the hikers and the enraged animal. Blinded and disoriented, the bear retreated with a final guttural snarl, crashing back into the forest. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's hands trembled as she lowered her beer spray. Mark doubled over, gasping for breath, his face pale. They approached Caleb cautiously, but it was clear he was gone. The bear's attack had been swift and devastating. Emma forced herself to look away, her mind already racing to the others. They found Sophie moments later, cradling her injured leg. Jenna hovered nearby, her face streaked with tears. Mark tore off his jacket to wrap around Sophie's leg, improvising a splint with a sturdy branch. The group regrouped, their movements mechanical as shock set in. The realization of what had just occurred hung over them like a storm cloud. Emma took charge, her voice steady despite the terror still coursing through her. They needed to move. Caleb's death was a tragedy, but staying in the area was too dangerous. Supporting Sophie between them, they retraced their steps, the trail back to safety seeming impossibly long. By the time they emerged from the forest, the sun was sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and crimson. Rangers met them at the trailhead, their expressions grim as Emma recounted the attack. Sophie was taken for medical treatment. Her injuries were non-life-threatening but serious. The others, physically unharmed but deeply shaken, were given blankets and a place to rest. In the days that followed, the story of the attack spread, serving as a stark reminder of the risks inherent in the wilderness. The hikers grappled with their trauma in their own ways. Emma, once confident and adventurous, found herself hesitating at the edge of familiar trails. Mark, who had always sought the thrill of the outdoors, now viewed it with a cautious respect. Jenna and Sophie, forever bonded by their shared ordeal, vowed to never underestimate nature again. Mark had always sought solace in the untamed wilderness. The Rocky Mountains, with their jagged peaks and sprawling valleys, had always been his haven. There was something about the vastness of nature, the sound of the wind through the pines, and the distant call of a hawk that cleared his mind like nothing else. He had planned this solo hike for months, carefully studying maps and stocking up on gear. As he climbed higher into the rugged terrain, the solitude wrapped around him like a familiar cloak. The first signs of bear activity appeared in the soft dirt near a cluster of huckleberry bushes. Deep gouges marred the ground, and the faint outline of a paw print sent a ripple of unease through him. But Mark dismissed it. He was experienced, equipped with bear spray, and confident in his ability to handle himself. The wilderness demanded respect, but not fear, he thought. The day pressed on and he trekked deeper into the mountains, the crisp air invigorating him. By midday, Mark reached a pristine stream nestled in a clearing. The water sparkled in the sunlight, and he decided it was the perfect spot for a break. He shrugged off his pack, sat on a flat rock, and dug out his lunch. The hum of the forest was hypnotic, the occasional rustle of leaves or chirp of a bird the only sounds. He was halfway through his sandwich when he noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The birds had stopped singing. The forest, so alive moments ago, had fallen into an eerie silence. He turned his head slowly and froze. On the opposite bank of the stream, a grizzly bear emerged from the trees. Its massive frame moved with a deliberate grace, the thick fur catching the light. Mark's heart pounded as he realized the bear had caught the scent of his food. It sniffed the air, eyes locking onto him. For a moment, neither moved. The bear's sheer size was staggering, its presence primal and overpowering. Mark knew he was no longer the top predator here. Slowly, he set the sandwich down and began to inch backward. He'd read countless guides on what to do in such situations. Don't run, Avoid eye contact, move slowly, but no amount of preparation could quell the surge of adrenaline flooding his veins. The bear's posture shifted as it stepped into the stream, water rippling around its legs. It wasn't a charge, not yet, but the intent was clear. Mark's mind raced, calculating his next move as the bear closed the distance. When the charge came, it was explosive. The bear's roar shattered the stillness, and in an instant, it was upon him. Mark's attempt to retreat turned into a frantic scramble. The bear's paw lashed out, knocking him off his feet and sending him sprawling into the dirt. Pain shot through his ribs as he rolled, instinctively curling to protect his vital organs. He fumbled for his bear spray, fingers trembling as he gripped the canister. The bear loomed over him, its breath hot and rancid, its eyes dark and unyielding. He managed to deploy the spray just as the bear lunged again. The mist erupted in a fiery cloud, striking the bear's face. It reared back with a guttural snarl, pawing at its eyes. Mark didn't wait to see the result. He scrambled to his feet, his mind screaming one word: climb. He bolted for the nearest tree, adrenaline dulling the pain in his side. The bark scraped his hands as he hauled himself upward, feet slipping on the lower branches. The bear, recovering from the spray, charged the base of the tree, roaring in frustration. Mark climbed higher, every muscle in his body burning as he pushed past the limits of exhaustion. The bear's claws raked the trunk below him, shaking the tree with its immense weight. For agonizing minutes, it seemed as though the bear might succeed in toppling the tree. Mark clung to a branch, his chest heaving, eyes wide as he stared down at the enraged predator. Gradually, the bear's efforts waned. It paced below, growling and sniffing the air, before finally retreating into the shadows of the forest. Hours passed. Mark remained perched in the tree, his body aching and his mind replaying the encounter in vivid detail. He knew that descending too soon could invite another attack. The light began to fade, the forest sinking into deep blue hues of twilight. The cold set in, seeping through his clothes and into his bones. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, set his nerves on edge. He'd never felt so vulnerable, so utterly at the mercy of nature. Night enveloped the mountains, and Mark's exhaustion finally overtook his fear. He drifted in and out of a restless sleep, his grip on the branches never loosening. The hours crawled by, each one an eternity. When dawn finally broke, its light felt like a lifeline. The forest seemed less menacing in the golden glow of morning, but Mark remained cautious. He scanned the area below, searching for any sign of the bear. Satisfied it was gone, he began his slow descent. Every movement was agony. His muscles protested, his ribs throbbed, and his hands were raw from the rough bark. When he reached the ground, he moved cautiously, his senses hyper-aware of every sound. The hike back to civilization was a blur of pain and determination. He clutched the canister of bear spray like a talisman, his only comfort in the vast wilderness. When he finally emerged onto a trail frequented by other hikers, relief flooded through him. He collapsed onto a log, trembling as the events of the past day caught up with him. Strangers approached, their concern evident, and someone called for help. Mark's injuries were minor compared to what could have been. He'd survived, but the weight of what had transpired hung heavy on him. As he was guided back to safety, Mark's thoughts were a whirlwind of gratitude and guilt. One careless decision, eating lunch in bear country without proper precautions, had nearly cost him his life. The wilderness was beautiful, but it was also unforgiving. The balance between awe and respect, he realized, was razor thin. Mark's encounter would stay with him forever. The scars on his hands and the ache in his ribs would fade, but the memory of the Grizzly's charge, the sheer terror of those moments, would remain etched in his mind. Jake Thornton had lived his entire life in the shadow of the rugged Bighorn Mountains of northern Wyoming. He was a man shaped by the land, hard-edged and resourceful. His son, Chris, had just turned 17 and was eager to learn the skills his father had mastered. This hunting trip was a rite of passage, a way for Jake to share his knowledge and for Chris to prove himself. The father and son set out early, hiking deep into the dense pine forest. The air was sharp with the smell of resin, and frost clung to the ground in stubborn patches. Jake carried his weathered hunting rifle with practiced ease, while Chris followed with a lighter pack and a bow slung over his shoulder. They tracked a small herd of deer for hours, finally sighting a young buck grazing in a clearing. Under Jake's watchful eye, Chris drew his bow and loosed an arrow. It struck true, and the buck went down quickly. Jake's nod of approval was all the affirmation Chris needed. By the time they returned to their campsite, the sun was sinking low, painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson. They strung up the deer and began the process of butchering, the methodical work serving as a bonding ritual between them. The surrounding forest seemed quiet, almost reverent as night fell. They stoked a fire and shared a meal, their laughter mingling with the crackle of burning wood. Jake felt a rare sense of contentment. Chris was learning and he was proud. But the wilderness was never truly quiet. Beyond the circle of firelight, a predator's eyes gleamed. A massive grizzly bear, drawn by the scent of blood and cooking meat, had been watching them for hours. Its hulking form moved silently among the shadows, calculating, patient. Jake's years of experience had not prepared him for the subtle menace lurking just beyond his awareness. The first sign of danger came in the form of a low growl, almost imperceptible over the crackling fire. Jake's instincts prickled, but it was too late. The bear charged, a sudden explosion of motion and sound that shattered the tranquility of the evening. Jake barely had time to grab his rifle before the grizzly was upon them. Chris froze, his eyes wide with terror as the bear lunged into the campsite. Jake's shot rang out, the bullet grazing the bear's shoulder and momentarily startling it. But the brief reprieve was all Jake managed. The grizzly turned its attention to Chris, swiping with a paw the size of a dinner plate. The force of the blow sent Chris sprawling, his cries of pain lost in the bear's deafening roar. Jake's heart pounded as he reloaded. The firelight cast monstrous shadows as the grizzly loomed over Chris, who clutched his bleeding leg. Jake fired again, the shot grazing the bear's flank. It turned on him with a fury that seemed to shake the earth. Dropping the rifle, Jake grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it wildly. The flames licked at the bear's face and it reared back, snarling. The brief moment of hesitation gave Jake time to think. He knew they couldn't outrun it. Chris couldn't even stand. The bear was enraged, driven by hunger and pain. Jake's mind raced through his options. Then he made a choice. He would lead the bear away. With a shout, he brandished the burning branch and ran into the forest. The bear, maddened by its wounds and the prospect of an easier target, charged after him. The ground was treacherous, roots and fallen branches threatening to trip him with every step. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps, his body screaming for rest, but he didn't stop. Behind him, the bear crashed through the undergrowth, its growls a constant reminder of how close it was. Jake's plan was desperate, but it worked. The bear followed him deeper into the forest, away from Chris and the camp. He led it toward a rocky outcrop he had noticed earlier that day, hoping to use the terrain to his advantage. As he reached the base of the outcrop, he turned to face the grizzly, his chest heaving. The bear slowed, its eyes glowing with a savage intelligence. Jake grabbed a jagged rock and hurled it at the beast. It struck the bear's snout, enraging it further. The grizzly lunged, and Jake scrambled up the rocky incline, his hands and knees scraping against the sharp stone. The bear followed, its claws scrabbling for purchase on the uneven surface. At the top, Jake found a narrow ledge and pressed himself against the rock face, the void yawning behind him. The bear reared up, swiping at him with claws that came within inches of his chest. In a final act of defiance, Jake thrust the burning branch into the bear's face. The flames caught its fur, and the acrid smell of singed hair filled the air. The bear let out a pained roar, retreating briefly. Jake seized the moment to climb higher, finding a crevice to wedge himself into. The bear clawed at the rock, but it couldn't reach him. Finally, with a frustrated growl, it retreated, disappearing into the dark forest. Jake stayed motionless for what felt like hours, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. When he was certain the bear was gone, he climbed down and made his way back to the campsite. Every step was a battle against his shaking legs and the overwhelming fatigue that threatened to consume him. Chris was alive, but barely. Blood stained the ground around him, and his face was pale. Jake worked quickly, using his belt as a makeshift tourniquet to stem the bleeding from Chris's leg. He wrapped the wounds as best he could, his hands steady despite the chaos they had just endured. Chris's breathing was shallow, but it was there. That was enough. Jake built a makeshift stretcher from branches in his pack, dragging Chris through the night toward the nearest road. The journey was grueling, every step a test of Jake's willpower. The stars overhead seemed cold and indifferent, and the forest, once a source of solace, now felt hostile and unforgiving. When they finally reached the road at dawn, Jake collapsed beside Chris. A passing truck stopped, its driver's alarmed face swimming in Jake's vision as exhaustion overtook him. They were taken to a hospital where Chris underwent emergency surgery. The doctors said he was lucky to be alive. Jake stayed by his son's side, his rugged exterior hiding the storm of guilt and relief within. The wilderness had tested them in the harshest way possible. Chris's injuries would heal, but the scars, both seen and unseen, would remain. Jake knew he would never look at the mountains the same way again. The land that had shaped him, that he had trusted, had nearly taken everything from him. The sun had begun its slow descent over the wilderness in Wyoming, casting golden light across the trees and meadows as the Richter family worked to set up their campsite. Thorne, the father, methodically pitched the tent, while his wife, Maria, unpacked supplies from the car. Their two children, Cale and Safine, darted around the clearing, weaving through the tall grass like restless birds. The family had chosen a remote section of the park, lured by the promise of solitude. A ranger had warned them about recent grizzly sightings, but Thorne had dismissed it. The food was locked away in a bear-proof container, and they would keep their campfire small. They were prepared, or so they believed. As twilight deepened, the forest around them came alive. Crickets chirped in a steady rhythm, and an owl's distant call floated through the cool air. Dinner was a simple affair. Foil-wrapped potatoes and sausages roasted over the fire. By the time the stars spread their vast net overhead, the family had retreated into their tent, lulled by the gentle hum of the wilderness. The night wore on in peace until an ominous sound shattered the stillness. It was faint at first, a rustling that could have been the wind, but then came the unmistakable clatter of metal. Thorne stirred, his mind slow to piece together the noise. By the time he sat up, heart pounding, the sound had escalated. Heavy breathing, snuffling, and the scrape of claws against the hard surface of the bear box. Maria's hand shot out, gripping his arm. In the dim glow of the tent's lantern, their wide eyes met. The children, still in their sleeping bags, stirred but remained asleep. Thorne moved carefully, unzipping the tent flap just enough to peer out. The sight froze him. A massive grizzly, its fur a rippling mass of muscle and power, loomed over the food container. The latch, designed to resist even the strongest predators, was holding for now. Thorne ducked back inside, his breath shallow. He reached for the air horn they'd brought, intending to scare the bear away. But before he could act, the grizzly turned its attention toward the tent. A low growl rumbled through the night, vibrating in their chests. Then, with terrifying speed, the bear charged. The impact was like a thunderclap. The flimsy fabric of the tent offered no resistance as the grizzly tore through it, its massive body a blur of fur and claws. Thorn was the first in its path. A powerful swipe sent him sprawling, blood blooming across his shoulder. The children screamed as Maria scrambled for the bear spray, fumbling with the safety cap in her panic. The grizzly reared up, its immense frame blocking out the starlight. It was searching for food, but its sheer presence turned the tent into chaos. Cale tried to crawl toward the exit, but a massive paw came down, inches from his legs, pinning the fabric to the ground. Maria finally managed to activate the bear spray, unleashing a cloud of noxious orange mist. The bear roared in fury, shaking its head as the irritant burned its eyes and nose. Disoriented and enraged, the grizzly thrashed, its claws ripping through the tent's remains. Maria kept spraying, inching toward Thorn, who struggled to sit up despite his injuries. The children huddled together, tears streaking their faces. Finally, with a guttural snarl, the bear retreated, crashing through the underbrush and disappearing into the night. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the family's ragged breathing. The campsite was a ruin. The tent lay in shreds, their belongings scattered and trampled. Blood dripped from Thorn's torn shoulder, pooling on the ground. Maria knelt beside him, pressing a sweatshirt against the wound to stem the bleeding. They had to move. Maria helped Thorn to his feet, his weight heavy against her. Cale and Safine clung to each other, their faces pale but resolute. There was no time for fear now. The bear could return at any moment. Taking the lead, Maria held the can of bear spray like a talisman, a fragile shield against the unknown. Thorn stumbled after her, one arm draped over her shoulders, his steps uneven yet determined. The children followed closely, their small hands clutching the straps of Maria's backpack. They left everything behind: the ruined tent, the food container, even their flashlights. The moonlight would have to guide them through the darkness. The forest, once so serene, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows and hidden threats. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent their hearts racing. Maria's mind cycled through worst-case scenarios. Another bear encounter, losing the trail, Thorn's wound becoming infected. Yet she forced herself to focus on the task at hand. Each step forward was a small victory against the chaos surrounding them. Hours passed in this grim march. Thorn grew weaker, his breath shallow and labored. Maria's shoulders ached from supporting him, but she refused to stop. Cale and Safine stumbled in the dark, their exhaustion evident, yet they pressed on without complaint. Finally, as the first light of dawn tinged the horizon, the ranger station came into view. It was a simple wooden structure, but to the family, it represented salvation. Maria banged on the door with the last of her strength, and within moments, a bleary-eyed ranger appeared. He took in the scene: Thorn's bloodied form, the children's tear-streaked faces, the haunted look in Maria's eyes, and sprang into action. In the aftermath, the family received treatment for their injuries and trauma. Thorn required stitches and a blood transfusion but would recover. The children, though shaken, bore no physical wounds. Maria, who had held them all together, remained stoic even as the gravity of their ordeal began to sink in. The ranger explained that the bear had likely been a desperate scavenger, drawn by the scent of food despite the secure container. Encounters like these were rare, but not unheard of, especially in remote areas. The family had been fortunate. Many such encounters ended far worse. Weeks later, back in the safety of their home, the Richter family would reflect on that night with a complex mix of gratitude and dread. The wilderness had revealed its raw, untamed power, a force that neither preparation nor courage could fully tame. Thorn's scars would fade with time, but the memory of the bear's roar and the weight of its presence would remain etched in their minds forever. The autumn air in the Canadian Rockies carried a sharp chill, crisp and invigorating. A thin layer of frost clung to the vibrant leaves scattered across the trail, glinting under the pale morning sun. A group of 5 tourists had gathered at the trailhead, their energy high and their voices bright with anticipation. Among them were Martel, tall and broad-shouldered, exuding the confidence of a self-assured adventurer. Nia, wiry and quick, always eager for the next thrill. Celine, with a new camera slung around her neck, ready to capture every moment. Rowan, who possessed a quiet but intense curiosity about the natural world. And Calix, whose laughter seemed to echo endlessly through the serene wilderness. None of them were seasoned hikers, but they were drawn to the Rockies' promise of untamed beauty. The warnings had been clear. Large yellow signs posted at the start of the trail cautioned about active bear sightings. Barren area, stay alert, do not approach wildlife. Yet, to people like Martel, such warnings often felt more like suggestions. He brushed off the notice with a casual shrug, and the others followed his lead, their collective confidence bolstered by numbers and a false sense of invulnerability. After all, they reasoned, they were just tourists out for a day hike. What harm could possibly come from sticking to the marked trails? The group's hike began uneventfully, winding through dense pines and firs, the earthy aroma of decaying leaves filling their senses. Celine lagged behind at times, her camera clicking incessantly as she captured the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. Nia and Calix joked about the possibility of spotting a bear, their laughter ringing through the stillness. They remained blissfully unaware of how easily sound could travel in the forest, or how their joviality might echo in the ears of creatures better left undisturbed. 2 hours into the hike, they crested a gentle rise and found themselves in a small clearing. A low thicket of shrubs dominated the area, their branches heavy with dark, ripe berries. The distinct musky scent in the air went unnoticed by the group, as did the subtle but telltale movement at the edge of the clearing. Roan was the first to spot the grizzly, its massive frame half hidden among the shrubs. For a moment, the group froze, their collective breath catching in their throats. The bear, a towering creature with a thick coat of tawny brown fur, was busy stripping berries from the bushes with surprising delicacy. The initial fear that gripped them quickly gave way to a thrill that dulled their instincts. Celine raised her camera, adjusting the lens for a closer shot. Martel motioned for the group to stay low and quiet, though his voice was more laced with excitement than caution. They believed they were at a safe distance, whispering and gesturing as Celine snapped picture after picture. But curiosity is a dangerous companion in the wild. Drawn in by the bear's imposing presence, Martel inched closer, emboldened by the animal's apparent indifference to their presence. Celine followed suit, her camera shutter clicking in rapid succession. Nia and Calix hesitated, lingering near Roan, who had begun to sense that their luck was wearing thin. The bear's agitation was subtle at first, a shift in its posture, a slight pause in its movements. Then came the unmistakable sound, a low, rumbling huff. Celine lowered her camera, but by then it was too late. The bear's head rose, its dark eyes locking onto Martel, who had ventured closest. In an instant, the grizzly's demeanor transformed from passive to menacing. It reared slightly, letting out a deep roar that sent a shockwave through the group. The charge was swift and terrifying. Martel barely had time to react before the bear's massive paw struck him with bone-crushing force. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious, before he even hit the frostbitten earth. The others scattered, adrenaline surging as they bolted back toward the trail. Nia tripped over a root, sprawling forward but managing to scramble up and keep running. Calix, the fastest of the group, sprinted ahead, his chest burning with exertion. Roan stayed close to Celine, who struggled to keep pace, her camera swinging wildly around her neck. The bear did not pursue them for long. After a few bounding strides, it halted, rising on its hind legs and roaring once more, as if to warn them against returning. The sound reverberated through the trees, a primal reminder of the creature's dominance. When the bear finally lowered itself back onto all fours, it turned and lumbered back to the thicket, reclaiming its meal as though nothing had happened. The group regrouped further down the trail, trembling and breathless. Nia's knees were scraped raw, and Roan's hands shook uncontrollably. Calix doubled over, dry heaving into the brush, while Celine's camera hung limply at her side, its lens cracked and useless. The realization hit them all at once. Martel was still back in the clearing, unconscious and alone. It took nearly an hour for them to summon the courage to seek help. Their phones had no signal, and the trailhead seemed impossibly far. Finally, they encountered another group of hikers who carried a satellite phone and contacted local authorities. A search and rescue team arrived hours later, venturing into the clearing with rifles at the ready. Martel was alive but gravely injured. The bear's initial blow had fractured his skull and left deep gashes across his chest. He was airlifted to the nearest hospital, where he remained in critical condition for weeks. The rest of the group's injuries were less visible but no less significant. They bore the weight of guilt and regret, replaying the encounter in their minds with agonizing clarity. News of the incident spread quickly, becoming a cautionary tale amplified by local media. Experts weighed in, emphasizing the importance of respecting wildlife and understanding the risks of venturing into bear country. The tourist's folly became a grim example of how ignorance and overconfidence could lead to disaster. In the months that followed, the group drifted apart, their bond fractured by the shared trauma. Nia abandoned her impulsive ways, redirecting her energy into environmental advocacy, determined to protect the wild spaces she once took for granted. Celine's camera collected dust on a shelf, a haunting reminder of her misplaced curiosity and the thrill that had turned to horror. Calix, once so carefree, found himself plagued by recurring nightmares, the bear's roar echoing in his mind long after the event. Roan immersed himself in studying wildlife behavior, driven by a desire to educate others about the dangers he had witnessed firsthand. Martel's recovery was slow and painful, marked by numerous surgeries and grueling physical therapy sessions. Though his body healed, his confidence never fully returned. He became a reluctant recluse, his broad shoulders now weighed down by the burden of a moment's arrogance, a constant reminder of how quickly everything could change. The Alaskan wilderness stretched wide and silent, a pristine expanse of evergreen forests and jagged mountains, embracing the small, remote cabin where Thane and Calla sought refuge for their weekend getaway. Their cabin sat perched near the edge of a glassy, mirror-like lake, its waters so still that they seemed to hold the sky in place. The air was crisp, carrying the faint musk of pine and the whisper of winter's approach. For Thane, who thrived on solitude, and Calla, who sought inspiration for her nature sketches, the setting was perfect. The warnings had been clear. A local they passed on the winding gravel road had mentioned recent bear activity, urging caution. But the couple, lulled by the serene beauty and their own eagerness to disconnect, took it lightly. The cabin's modest structure, a single room with a loft above, a small kitchen, and a narrow deck, seemed secure enough. Besides, they told themselves, they would be careful. That was before the evening crept in with its cold breath and the events that would sear this weekend into their memories forever. The day had been uneventful. Calla spent hours sketching the lake, while Thane chopped wood for the fire. As dusk fell, a golden hue draped over the forest, and the couple retreated indoors, ready to prepare dinner. The aroma of sizzling bacon and onions filled the cabin as Calla stirred a pot on the stove, its small flame casting flickering shadows on the walls. The door had been left slightly ajar to let out the cooking smoke, a decision made carelessly in the moment. Outside, the forest's quiet began to shift. Branches rustled, not with the gentle sway of the wind, but with a purposeful motion. A low crunch of leaves and the snapping of twigs drew nearer. Thane, at first oblivious, caught the sound as he poured water into 2 tin mugs. His hand froze mid-pour. A shadow loomed in the doorway, impossibly large, its outline unmistakable even in the dim light of the single lantern hanging above. The grizzly bear's head ducked into view, its black eyes gleaming with curiosity, its nose twitching as it caught the tantalizing scent of food. The moment stretched taut as the bear lumbered further inside, its massive frame almost filling the doorway. Calla, motionless by the stove, barely breathed. Thane's thoughts raced. He had read about bear encounters and knew enough to remain still and avoid startling it. But the proximity of the animal, the sheer size of its muscular bulk, made rational thought waver. The bear's interest in the food quickly turned into volatile hunger. It knocked over a small table, sending cutlery clattering to the floor. The crash shattered the fragile tension, and the bear's demeanor shifted. Curiosity gave way to agitation. Its growl rumbled deep, vibrating the wooden walls, and it swiped a paw across the stove, sending the pot's contents spilling onto the floor. Thane gestured silently toward the loft ladder, urging Calla upward. She moved slowly, keeping her eyes on the bear, her breath shallow. As she reached the ladder, the bear's growls turned into sharp huffs. It lunged at the counter, its claws raking across the wood. The sound of splintering timber filled the cabin. Thane stepped back, his foot catching on a fallen chair leg, and he stumbled. The movement caught the bear's attention. It turned toward him, jaws slightly open, saliva glistening in the lantern light. Heart pounding, Thane scrambled to his feet and followed Calla up the ladder. The loft provided no real protection, but it was the only option. The bear, frustrated by the sudden lack of movement below, stood on its hind legs, reaching for the ladder. Its claws scraped the first rung, then the second, before its bulk forced it to drop back down. Enraged, it began to prowl the cabin, smashing furniture and clawing at the walls. The couple huddled in the loft, their backs pressed against the far wall. Thane's mind churned with futile ideas for escape. He spotted the bear spray they had brought, but had left uselessly below on the counter. The bear roared, its deep guttural sound shaking dust from the rafters. It lunged at the counter again, this time finding an open bag of trail mix. The crunching and tearing sounds were deafening. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The bear continued its rampage, overturning the stove and ripping through their backpacks. Thane's arm tightened around Calla, who trembled beside him, her sketches scattered on the floor below, trampled and torn. The air grew thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and the bear's musky odor. Eventually, the bear's frenzy began to wane. Its hunger sated and curiosity dulled. It wandered to the door, its movements slower. For a long moment it stood silhouetted against the moonlight, then lumbered out into the night. The silence that followed was almost as jarring as the chaos had been. The couple remained in the loft, afraid to move, their muscles cramped and hearts still racing. Hours passed before they dared to descend. The cabin was unrecognizable. The small table and chairs were reduced to splinters, the counter shredded, and their belongings scattered and destroyed. The door hung askew on broken hinges, swinging faintly in the night breeze. When the first light of dawn broke, Thane ventured outside cautiously, scanning the forest for any sign of the bear. The ground was littered with paw prints and the grass was flattened where the grizzly had lingered. He retrieved the emergency radio from their supply kit, miraculously intact beneath an overturned crate, and called for help. A rescue team arrived hours later, finding the couple shaken but unharmed. The team's leader, a seasoned ranger, assessed the scene with a grim expression, noting how narrowly they had escaped harm. The bear, he explained, was likely an older male, driven by the need to fatten up before hibernation. The cabin's lingering food smells had made it impossible for the animal to resist. Thane and Calla were escorted back to the nearest town, where they spent the following days in a small inn. The physical wounds were non-existent, but the psychological scars ran deep.